So good morning to everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation to present this paper. I'm sorry I could not be there in person. Would have loved to be there, except that this is the final week of exams here, so I just gave a final exam for my course today. But I'm very glad to be able to present what I think would be a highly topical paper for the audience at this conference. So this is joint work with Nishith Prakash from the University of Connecticut, and in fact was financially supported by the IGC Bihar program. So this is a great occasion to present this. So the motivation for the paper is pretty straightforward. So here is a quote from Larry Summers when he was the chief economist at the World Bank, where he said, "Investment in girls' education may well be the highest return investment available in the developing world." So I'm not going to get into all the reasons for this, but it's widely accepted now, and therefore that increasing female school attainment is one of the Millennium Development Goals and has been one of the top priorities for international education policy. The problem, however, is that even though significant progress has been made at the primary level, getting female school attendance and completion up is still a major challenge at the secondary level, and we see a steep dropout at adolescence and puberty. So the most common policy approaches to improving female school education include some kind of demand-side interventions, which are typically conditional cash transfers, unconditional cash transfers. Increasingly, there's what are called frame cash transfers. But overall, one of the most commonly tried approaches is to reward families and compensate them and provide them financial payments in return for keeping their girls in school. Now, the other side of this is the supply side interventions, which focus on school construction and access and improving access to schooling. So primary schools now exist within 1 kilometer of most villages in India, but distance is still an important barrier to secondary school, and this may be especially true for girls. So here's just some simple pictures that show you how female enrollment drops drastically by age. So you can see this as for every age the boys' enrollment is higher, but the drop-off of girls is particularly steep once you hit the adolescent years. So what is the policy context and what is the intervention we study? We're in the state of Bihar, which is one of India's largest states and has a population of over 100 million. So it's exactly about the size of the Punjab province, where you are all sitting right now, and the Punjab province in Pakistan, of course. And it's also one of the most educationally backward states in India as of 2004. So the government of Bihar hoped to boost girls' secondary education by launching a rather innovative program in 2006, which provided bicycles to all girls enrolling in secondary school, which is basically grade 9 and 10. So it was a grant of rupees 2,000, which is then increased to 2,500 of about $50, well, $40 given the exchange rate now, to buy a bicycle. And so one thing the government did here was that they did not directly provide the bicycle to the girls. They provided cash to eligible students through the school in public ceremonies, and the receipts for purchase of cycles were collected through the schools. So this was effectively a conditional kind transfer program and was one of India's first scaled up conditional transfer programs for girls' secondary education. So in some sense, the salient features of the program, I think I like to think about this as a unique hybrid of a demand and a supply side intervention. So the enrollment conditionality to get the cycle resembles a traditional conditional cash transfer, because you need to be enrolled as a condition for getting the transfer. But it's also a supply side intervention because cycles improve school access by reducing the distance cost of attendance. So one of the nice things about this is that it allows economies of scale at the school level. So one challenge in primary education in India is that we build schools within 1 kilometer of every habitation, but a lot of these schools are in fact subscale. And so there's this trade-off between access and scale, and this way it allows you to have larger schools with facilities, toilets, laboratories, and other things that you would want, but at the same time improve school access by providing transportation facilities. So it's a very high-profile program, was politically very visible, and also has now been copied by other states. And several qualitative reports, newspaper reports, and coverage around the election has kind of claimed that this was a transformative program and a game changer. So it's a program that, got a lot of pre-election coverage, and it's something the Chief Minister of Bihar used to highlight as one of his proudest achievements. So clearly, there is a sense on the ground that this program has had an impact. But on the other hand, there's no reliable quantitative evaluation of the program impact on schooling, and there's lots of reasons to be skeptical of any real impact. So why might we be skeptical? So the potential reasons for non-impact of the cycle program include just poor implementation and high corruption. And the other subtle point is that maybe the cycles are mainly going to girls who would have gone to school anyway, right? So these are the inframarginal girls. So yes, you've given out a lot of cycles, but it's not clear that the cycles have induced additional enrollment. Now, of course, the government will say, if you look at the trends, you got a big increase in girls enrollment, but maybe this was driven by the faster economic growth in Bihar. Maybe this was driven by other factors, such as improvement in law and order. So how do we know what is the causal impact of the cycle program? And that's what this paper is trying to do. So the paper aims to estimate the impact of the cycle program on secondary school enrollment and learning outcomes for girls. And we'll also evaluate the cost effectiveness and draw lessons for the larger debate on cash versus kind transfers. So the main challenge with the empirical analysis, and I already alluded to this, is that the program was implemented statewide. So there's no clear control group. So if you look at the changes over time, this could be driven by economic growth. It could be driven by a lot of other factors, other programs. So how do you isolate what is the impact of the cycle program? So what do? The first thing we do is we look at the difference in enrollment for girls over time. So that is the first difference. But then we use the boys as a control group and compare the change in girls enrollment with the change in boys enrollment. And the reason that works is that the boys are also exposed to the changes in economic growth and changes in school construction and other initiatives, but the boys are not getting the cycle program. Now, the problem is that this is still not perfect because the parallel trends assumption might be violated. And in fact, it turns out it is. So what we do is we have a triple difference where we use the neighboring state of Jharkhand to compare. And in many ways, this is the perfect control state because it used to be part of the state of Bihar till 2001 and it's split into a separate state. So we will do a triple difference comparing the double difference across Bihar and Jharkhand. Now the problem is you still have to worry about omitted variables, which I'll talk about. So our most convincing analysis is the following, which is that if the impact of the program was because of the cycle itself, we should see differential impacts by distance to school. And the basic logic is simple, that if the school is very nearby, then the cycle should not make such a big difference because the school was accessible anyway. But if the school was further away, and we'll show 3 to 5 to 7 kilometers ends up being a bit of a sweet spot, it's at that intermediate distance that you should see the highest impact if the impact is because the cycle program was reducing the distance costs of going to school. So what we'll do is we'll plot this triple difference as a function of the distance to the school, and we'll also show you a quadruple difference, which is we'll take this triple difference and cut it above and below the median distance to the school. So, and then beyond that, we'll also talk about the impacts on learning outcomes. We'll discuss robustness, cost effectiveness, and draw implications for cash versus kind debates. So the summary of the results is that we find that the program led to a large and significant increase in the age-appropriate secondary school participation or completion for girls. So we find that the age-appropriate enrollment went up by 30%. So this was about 5.2 percentage points on a base enrollment of 17%. And it also bridged the gender gap in age-appropriate enrollment by 40%. So the pre-existing boys enrollment was 30%, so 5.2% of a gap of 13 is bridging that gap by 40%. So the other thing is that the effects are completely driven by cases where the distance to the nearest secondary school was at or above the median distance, which is 3 kilometers. And if you compare for the girls who live more than 3 kilometers away, you get a 9 percentage point increase on a base of 12%. So you're increasing enrollment by 75% of a base of 12% for the girls who are living 3 kilometers or above away from a school. Now, one good news is that there is a significant increase not just in enrollment, but also the number of girls who attempted the 10th standard exam. So it shows that this was not just I enrolled in school and took the cycle and dropped out. The girls do stay in school to the point of taking the 10th class exam, but we don't find any significant increase in the number of girls who passed the 10th standard, which suggests that that is going to be the next frontier to work on. We find that the program was significantly more cost effective than comparable conditional cash transfer programs. And the possible mechanisms for this include that the cycles were more sticky within the household. So this was a way of the transfer completely sticking to the girl as opposed to being dissipated in the household. But I think the other thing that's going on is it looks like there might be spillovers from the coordinated provision of bicycles to girls that include safety and social norms, which I'll talk about towards the end. So let me just quickly give you some context since I have only 10 more minutes. So here's the state of Bihar, and you'll see the state of Jharkhand, which is going to be our control group, and this is the state of about 100 million people. This is just some pictures of girls and cycles in schools. You can see this is kind of a big thing. It's a visible thing. Here is more girls, in this case, I think from a Muslim neighborhood, going to schools. And this is a picture I found recently, which just gives you a sense, particularly in the setting you're in, about that this is a really big deal, okay? So this is only in last year, in 2013, that Saudi Arabia lifts bans on women riding bicycles. And so clearly there is a sense in which allowing girls to ride bicycles is not just about going to school, but it's also likely to be an important form of empowerment. So I'm going to go through this quickly. We basically use a 2008 district level health survey, which ends up being a fantastic data set because it has over 1,000 households per district, and we have a total sample of about 50,000 households. And the survey is conducted at the perfect time for us because it comes about 1.5 years after the cycle program was launched. So what we can do is we treat the younger cohorts of girls as the treated cohort and the older cohort as the control cohort, because the older cohort did not have access to the program at a time when they were making the transition into secondary school. So this is exactly the same as Esther Duflo's AER paper. And the dependent variable is whether you're enrolled in or completed class 9. So then the first difference is going to be the younger versus the older girls. The second difference is then comparing this with the boys. The third difference will compare the double difference across Bihar and Jharkhand. And the quadruple difference will take this triple difference and compare it above and below the median distance to school. Okay, and we also collect the data on passing, and I'm going to do this quickly. Okay, so here's the main result. So this is the triple difference, and the number I want you to focus on is in column 4 in the top. And so that shows you that the treated cohorts, which are the younger girls, who are girls and who are in Bihar, increase enrollment by about 5.2 percentage points. So on a base of 17%, this is about a 30% increase in enrollment. So this is exactly what I told you, that the exposure to the cycle program increased the age-appropriate secondary school enrollment of girls by 30%. And it also reduced the gender gap by 40%, right? So this was 5.2 percentage points of a pre-existing gender gap of 13%. Now, and we find no significant heterogeneity by demographic variables. So what is the problem? The problem is that this result can still be confounded with other factors. So if you have higher growth rates in Bihar, and if you have greater income elasticity of girls' school participation relative to boys, you might still be overestimating this result relative to the counterfactual. So it's also possible there might be differential trends in returns to education for girls in Bihar. So what do? So here's a simple picture, and what it shows you is the following. On the x-axis, you have the distance to school. On the y-axis, you have the cost and benefit of going to school. So the entire point is that the benefit of going to school does not vary as a function of the distance, but the cost very much does. So before the cycles, if you're walking to school, there's a very steep cost of going to school as a function of the distance. But what the cycle does is it reduces the cost of going to school proportional to the distance. And so what you can see is that if you were very near the school, the program should not have had a big impact. If you were very far away from a school, it wouldn't have had an impact because even after the cycle, it's too far. You're not going to cycle 20 kilometers and go to school. So it's in these intermediate distances that you're most likely to see the impact if the mechanism is driven by the cycle. And there's this beautiful picture, which is a non-parametric triple difference, and you see that this is exactly the effect that we find. That you find that there's very little effect at distances between 0 and 3 kilometers, and similarly not much at distances over 20 kilometers. And the core effect is found in this intermediate range between about 5 to 13 kilometers, which is exactly consistent with the mechanism of the impact being that the cycle reduced the distance cost for going to school. So this is the double difference, and this highlights the importance of Jharkhand as a control group, you see. So now you see, if you just look at the double difference in Bihar, that girls' enrollment is going up at all distances, not just the intermediate distances. But Jharkhand is also seeing an increase in girls' enrollment, but as you would expect, if girls' enrollment is going up, it will first go up in places where the schools are nearby. So then when you take the difference, the difference of the double differences and get the triple difference, then you basically get that inverted U pattern that we just showed you. So this is the quadruple difference, taking up that triple difference and breaking it up by above and below the median. So if you look at column 4, you'll see that for the treated girls, that's the younger cohort, who are female, who are in Bihar, for whom the secondary school is more than 3 kilometers away, you get an increase of about 8.8 percentage points. So the robustness, I'm not going to have too much time for this. The main thing we have to worry about is this. In spite of these 4 differences, are there other factors that could generate the same pattern that we saw in the previous picture? And unfortunately, the answer is yes. And that's mainly because there's an improvement in roads and law and order. And this could also have a differential positive impact on girls as an increasing function of distance to school. So what we do is we conduct a placebo test by looking at the triple difference estimate for 8th standard girls. And here, the girls are identical except they don't get the cycle program, right? And we find that there's no differential impact in the 8th standard and all the impact is in the 9th standard, which again suggests that it's the cycle that's driving this, okay? So, and then we also restrict the analysis to border districts and find that there's no difference. So overall, this appears to be quite robust. So let me spend my last 5 minutes. So on mechanisms, the one thing we don't have is the survey that we use does not have how many cycles the house has, and it does not ask a question about whether each member owns a cycle. So we cannot directly do that. But fortunately, the IGC also commissioned another study led by Matish Ghatak and Chinmay Kumar and Sandeep Mitra, and they find it's more of an evaluation of the process, and they confirmed that the program is well implemented and that 97% of eligible beneficiaries receive the benefit. So what it suggests is that the program was implemented properly. And finally, if you look at our survey data and look at the older cohorts and look at the stated reasons for dropping out, you find that about the majority of them say they drop out because they don't need more education or don't want more education. And so for them, giving a cycle is not going to make a difference, right? But about 7.6% of those who drop out say that it was because of distance. And so those are the people for whom you would expect the cycle program to make an impact. And so our estimated treatment effects of about 5.2 percentage point is in the right ballpark, given the stated frequency of responses that say they dropped out because of distance. So then you go to academic outcomes. Okay, so here the good news is that you see in the first column a significant increase in the number of candidates who appear for the 10th standard exam, but in the second column you see that there's no impact on those who passed. So focus on the first row. And so this is consistent with other conditional cash transfer studies around the world that find that these conditional programs improve enrollment but not learning outcomes. And so we can discuss those reasons in Q&A if you'd like to. So let me spend my last 4 minutes talking now about cost effectiveness and kind of putting this in a larger picture. So it's kind of nice because the comparison I have is with a conditional cash transfer program in Pakistan, in fact in Punjab. So the very natural comparison here is the most common policy that most governments are doing to keep girls in school is CCT. And so there's a program in Pakistan that was evaluated by Chowdhury and Parajuli that also found a significant positive impact, and they also use a triple difference estimate. And so they find that that program cost about $3 a month and increased enrollment by 9%. So this was a 4 percentage point improvement on a base of 43%. So the cycle program, it cost much less. It cost less than $1 a month. And as opposed to 9% increase, it had a 40% increase. So it's a much larger effect, and particularly on an even lower base for adolescent post-puberty girls in class 9, where getting the enrollment up is more difficult than say in class 6 to 8. So the cycle program both cost less and was more effective. And so what's interesting is that these results contrast with another study which I did in Andhra Pradesh, where we find that when you give in-kind transfers, you give books and notebooks and a lot of in-kind resources to kids in schools. This we found had almost no effect. And what was happening was the households were cutting back their own spending when you provide materials in kind. And so it's an interesting contrast that over here you gave something in kind and you had a big effect. Over there you gave something in kind and it had no effect. So it makes it a good setting to think about when in-kind benefits may be better than cash. So it's worth thinking about why may the cycle program have done better than a conditional cash transfer. So the first is that the cycle reduced the cost of going to school. The cycle was not inframarginal to household spending, so they were not buying this anyway. And now, of course, the economist would say that if the cycle was the key to helping the girl go to school, then maybe the household could have used the cash transfer to bicycles. So why would they not do that? One is credit constraints, but the other is intra-household bargaining, which is that when the money is given as a conditional cash transfer, the girl's share of that is only going to be her weight in the household, the Pareto weight. Whereas by giving the transfer as a cycle to the girl, the social planner might have been able to jump over the head of the household to make the transfer stick to the targeted girl. And so that's a very interesting facet of this program. And finally, I think talking to people in the field, a lot of the qualitative evidence here is that the coordinated provision of cycles, you see, this is not just saying I gave one girl a cycle or two girls a cycle. You gave hundreds of thousands of cycles. And so it's likely that this generated positive externalities beyond the individual cycle, because now when girls are cycling to school in groups, there is safety in groups. And you're also potentially changing the social norms against girls leaving the village to go to school by providing this coordinated transfer. So I think that's kind of what makes this program very exciting. Now, the last point I want to make is on the implementation side, is why was the cycle program implemented so well with 3% leakage in a setting of historically poor governance? Okay, so in places in Bihar, sectors like PDS and ICDS still have very high rates of leakage. So what made this program different? And that's again going to be relevant to our policy counterparts. And so again, based on qualitative field reports and extensive secondary research, we find that some of the key drivers were universal eligibility. So there is no corruption in the targeting margin, because everyone's eligible. It's a one-time highly visible transfer as opposed to small monthly transfers. It was distributed in public ceremonies, and it provides a visible forum for complaints. And also, of course, unlike say PDS or other benefits that go to the poorest of the poor, the girls who are affected by this program are already on the higher end of the SCS, because remember, only about 20 to 30% of girls go to school. So this is already the more advantaged of that group. So maybe they can stand up for their rights better. And finally, let's not underestimate the importance of political rewards, that this was a very politically visible program and it had the commitment of the chief minister and the senior leadership of the government. But the important point is that all of these are straightforward to replicate in other settings. So to summarize, I'm just going to wrap this up and say that the cycle program appears to have been quite unique in its ability to effectively provide a non-fungible transfer to girls that was not captured by either households or officials, and which thereby reduced the daily cost of attendance for girls. So I'm not going to talk about policy and research. We can talk about this in the Q&A. But I just want to end up with this final quote. So we started with this quote from Larry Summers, but let me end with a quote by Susan Anthony, who says, "I think the bicycle has done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world." So Susan B. Anthony was the leader of the women's suffrage and women's voting rights movement in the United States in the 19th century. So she's one of the leading figures. And for her to say that the bicycle has done more to emancipate women than anything else kind of helps us think about what a big deal this might be and how much of a game changer it might be by not just sending girls to school, but improving empowerment and changing social norms with regard to girls' school attendance. So I'm 2 minutes over, and let me stop there.